A millionaire didn't know he had triplets until the day he visited his wife's grave and saw 3 boys standing there crying. At first, he thought they were strangers, until one of them looked up and asked. That's when everything changed. Because these boys weren't just visitors, they were his sons. 18 years old, raised without him, and full of questions he's not sure he can answer. Why did she never tell him? Why did she run? And now that he's found them, will they ever let him in? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The gray clouds hung low over the cemetery, casting a somber blanket across the weathered headstones. An old Honda Civic, its blue paint dulled by years and decorated with a collection of small dents, pulled up to the iron gates. The engine sputtered briefly before falling silent. 3 identical faces peered through the windshield at the misty morning scene. Eli, sitting behind the wheel, took a deep breath and glanced at his brothers. In the passenger seat, Noah drummed his fingers against the thermos in his lap, his jaw tight. Micah sat quietly in the back, 3 simple bouquets of mixed flowers carefully arranged beside him. Same spot as always? Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. They'd been coming here for 5 years now, the last 3 on their own. Noah nodded, his fingers still tapping an anxious rhythm. Yeah, row 14, plot 23. They stepped out of the car in unison, a habit formed from years of moving through life together. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of wet grass and fallen leaves. Their footsteps crunched along the gravel path, echoing in the stillness. Micah clutched the flowers close to his chest, protecting them from the light breeze. Around his neck, their mother's locket swayed gently with each step. He'd taken to wearing it daily since her passing, though he rarely opened it anymore. The familiar path led them past aging monuments and fresh graves until they reached their mother's resting place. The gray granite headstone stood clean and well-maintained, a testament to their regular visits. Noah pulled out 3 small cleaning cloths from his jacket pocket, another part of their ritual. Without speaking, they began their practiced routine. Eli wiped down the left side of the stone, Noah the right, while Micah carefully cleaned the base. The inscription emerged clearer with each gentle stroke. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, beloved mother and guardian angel. Once satisfied with their work, Micah arranged the bouquets, purple irises, yellow daisies, and pink carnations, in the built-in stone vase. Noah unscrewed the thermos, the familiar scent of chamomile and lavender tea, their mother's favorite blend, drifting up with the steam. From his backpack, Eli produced 4 small ceramic cups, another tradition they couldn't bear to break. They'd started bringing the 4th cup during their first visit alone, a silent acknowledgement of their mother's continued presence in their lives. Your tea's getting cold, Mom, Noah murmured, his usual sharp edges softened by memory as he poured the golden liquid into each cup, including the one that would remain untouched. They settled onto the grass, forming a semicircle around the headstone. Each brother lost in his own thoughts, their silence comfortable and familiar. Eli sipped his tea slowly, remembering late-night homework sessions with their mother checking their math at the kitchen table. Micah traced the outline of the locket with his fingers, thinking of afternoons spent drawing while she hummed old songs. Noah stared into his cup, recalling how she'd taught him to fix their temperamental toaster, her patience never wearing thin despite his frustrated outbursts. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of tires on gravel. A black sedan, sleek and expensive-looking, pulled up nearby. The brothers exchanged glances, unused to sharing this private time with strangers. Their eyes tracked the man who stepped out, tall, well-dressed in a charcoal suit, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He carried a bouquet of pristine white tulips, their perfection almost artificial compared to the brothers' modest arrangements. The man's steps were measured, heavy with purpose, until he caught sight of the 3 young men at the grave. His polished appearance cracked slightly, revealing something raw underneath, recognition, shock, and something else they couldn't quite name. The brothers rose slowly, instinctively drawing closer together. Noah's hands clenched into fists at his sides, while Eli's eyes narrowed, analyzing every detail of the stranger's familiar features. Micah stepped forward slightly, his artist's eye catching subtle similarities that made his heart race. "What are you doing here?" Micah's quiet voice carried across the space between them, steady despite the tremor in his hands. The man's composure crumbled further. His lips parted, closed, then opened again as he struggled to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "This is my wife's grave." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Noah stumbled back as if physically struck, color draining from his face. Micah's fingers flew to the locket, clutching it like a lifeline. Eli's analytical mind raced, connecting dots he'd never known existed. In the heavy silence that followed, one of them, later, none could remember who, whispered the words that had already formed in all their minds. "She never told us she had a husband." The man's eyes darted between their identical faces, taking in features that must have seemed like mirrors of the past. His shock was evident, his next words barely audible. "Wait, triplets." The white tulips trembled in his grasp, petals catching the weak morning light. 5 people stood frozen in that moment, surrounded by stone monuments to the dead, as years of carefully constructed understanding began to crumble around them. The morning mist clung to the cemetery grounds as 5 people stood frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. The well-dressed man, Daniel, took several careful steps backward, his polished shoes crunching against loose gravel. His face showed a mix of wonder and uncertainty, as if he feared any sudden movement might shatter this impossible moment. Noah's hands trembled at his sides, his face darkening with each passing second. The muscle in his jaw twitched as he clenched his teeth, fighting back words that threatened to explode from him. His eyes burned with an anger that had been simmering for years, finally finding a target. Eli moved forward with the measured calm he'd perfected over years of mediating between his brothers. His steps were deliberate, placing himself slightly between Noah and Daniel. "Who are you, really?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest. Daniel swallowed hard, his grip on the white tulips loosening slightly. "My name is Daniel Marlowe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I—" He paused, looking down at the headstone, then back at the 3 identical faces before him. "I was married to your mother, to Lena." "Lena?" Micah whispered, his fingers still wrapped around the locket. "Nobody called her that. She was Sarah to everyone." "Sarah Matthews," Daniel nodded, a flash of pain crossing his features. "But she was Lena Marlowe when I knew her, when we were married." Noah made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a growl. "Married? That's impossible. Mom never—" "We were young," Daniel continued, his words coming faster now, as if afraid they'd stop listening. "Both just 22. We'd known each other for 2 years, been married for barely 1 when—" He trailed off, his free hand running through his graying hair. "We had an argument, a terrible one. I said things, cruel things I've regretted every day since. The next morning, she was gone." Eli's analytical mind kicked into gear. "Gone? Just like that?" "I filed a missing persons report," Daniel said, his voice heavy with old grief. "Hired private investigators, searched for almost a year, but she'd—" He gestured helplessly. "She'd vanished completely, changed her name, moved away, cut every tie. I never knew." His eyes moved between the 3 young men. "I never knew she was pregnant." "Bull!" Noah spat, taking an aggressive step forward. Eli's arm shot out, holding him back. "If you really loved her, you would have tried harder. You would have found her." "I did try," Daniel insisted, his composed exterior cracking further. "I searched everywhere I could think of. called every contact we had. But Lena, your mother, she was brilliant. When she wanted to disappear, she knew exactly how to do it. Micah spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you here now? Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly. I found out about her passing through a local obituary 5 years ago. Sarah Matthews. I almost missed it. But there was a photo, and even after all those years. He drew a shaky breath. I've been coming here every year since, on her birthday. I never expected to find. He gestured at the three of them, wonder and grief mixing in his expression. I never knew I had sons. This is crap, Noah snarled, turning away from the grave. His boots kicked up loose dirt as he stalked away, hands jammed deep in his pockets. The tension in his shoulders spoke of barely contained rage. Micah remained rooted to the spot, his artist's eye taking in every detail of Daniel's face, the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, features that suddenly seemed eerily familiar. He hadn't moved since Daniel's first revelation, as if motion might break whatever spell held them all in this moment. Eli kept his voice soft but firm as he addressed Daniel. You said she was your wife. Prove it. Daniel met his gaze steadily, something like hope flickering in his eyes. I can. He shifted the tulips to one arm, reaching into his suit jacket with his free hand. From an inner pocket, he withdrew what looked like an old photograph, handling it with careful reverence. He held it out to them, and Micah finally moved, stepping forward to take it with trembling fingers. The photo showed a much younger Daniel, dark hair without any gray, standing beside a woman in a white wedding dress. Her smile was radiant, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her eyes bright with joy and love. Micah's fingers flew to the locket around his neck, fumbling with the clasp until it opened. Inside was a small photo, worn around the edges from years of handling. He held both images side by side, his breath catching in his throat. The woman was unmistakably the same. Their mother, Sarah Matthews, Lena Marlowe, younger and happier than they'd ever known her, but undeniably her. The proof they'd demanded was there in black and white, forcing them to question everything they'd thought they knew about their past. The four men stood in the cemetery, surrounded by monuments to the dead and the weight of unspoken truths. The morning mist had begun to lift, but the heavy clouds remained, matching the gravity of the moment. Their mother's tea sat cooling in 4 cups by her headstone, a ritual interrupted by revelations none of them had been prepared to face. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the apartment above Joey's auto repair. The constant hum of machinery from below provided a familiar backdrop to the heavy silence that filled the small kitchen. The apartment wasn't much: mismatched furniture, worn carpet, and walls that needed a fresh coat of paint. But it had been home to the 3 brothers for the past 2 years. Micah sat at the scratched kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edges of his mother's locket. Beside it lay Daniel's wedding photo, the contrast between the 2 images stark under the fluorescent kitchen light. The happy bride in the wedding photo seemed worlds away from the quiet, hard-working single mother they'd known. Noah paced the small living room, his heavy boots wearing an invisible path in the carpet. Every few minutes, he'd stop, open his mouth as if to speak, then shake his head and resume his relentless movement. The anger radiated from him in almost visible waves. Eli hunched over his laptop at the other end of the table, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. The blue light from the screen reflected off his glasses as he methodically searched through public records, news archives, and old missing person databases. His expression remained neutral, but his shoulders grew increasingly tense with each new search. Found something, Eli muttered, breaking the thick silence. His brothers gravitated toward him immediately, even Noah pausing his pacing to lean over Eli's shoulder. Missing person report from 18 years ago. Daniel Marlowe reporting his wife, Lena Marlowe, missing. He scrolled through the scanned document. Everything matches. Her description, the date, even mentions the argument the night before. That doesn't prove anything, Noah growled, but his voice held a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. A knock at the door made all three brothers jump. Through the frosted glass panel, they could make out a tall figure holding something bulky. Eli rose from his chair, exchanging glances with his brothers before crossing to the door. He opened it cautiously to find Daniel standing there, his suit jacket gone, sleeves rolled up, holding a worn cardboard box. "May I come in?" Daniel asked quietly. No demand in his voice, just a gentle question. Eli hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "5 minutes," he said firmly. Daniel entered their space carefully, like someone approaching skittish animals. His eyes took in the modest apartment without judgment, landing briefly on the wedding photo still lying on the kitchen table. He placed the box down gently beside it. "I brought some things," he said, his movements deliberate as he began removing items from the box. "Things I think you should see." The first item he placed on the table was a thick file folder, yellowed with age. "The original missing person report," he explained, "and all the follow-up investigations." Next came a large map, creased and worn at the folds, covered in red pins and handwritten notes. "Every place I searched," Daniel said softly. "Every lead I followed, every dead end I hit." A leather-bound album followed, its pages thick with photographs. "Our wedding album. There are more pictures of your mother here, if you want to see them." His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out a small journal, its pages wavy from handling. The cover faded to a pale blue. "This was Lena's, your mother's. She left it behind the night she..." He swallowed hard. "The night she left." Finally, he removed something small and delicate. A paper tulip, yellowed but perfectly preserved, crafted with precise folds. A small note was attached to its stem in familiar handwriting. "For D. Come find me." Daniel arranged everything on the table with careful precision, then stepped back. He didn't launch into explanations or try to force the items on them. He simply stood there, letting the evidence of his search and his loss speak for itself. The brothers stared at the collection of artifacts, each processing the sight in their own way. Noah's pacing had stopped entirely, his eyes fixed on the paper tulip. Eli leaned forward to examine the missing person report, comparing it to the digital version he'd found. Micah reached for the journal with trembling fingers. The leather was soft under Micah's touch as he opened the journal. The handwriting inside was achingly familiar, the same precise script that had written notes in their lunchboxes and signed their school permission slips. He flipped through pages randomly until a particular entry caught his eye. His voice was barely above a whisper as he read aloud. "I don't know if Daniel is still looking. I don't know if I want him to find me. But if he ever does, I hope he brings white tulips." The words hung in the air like smoke. Noah's face contorted with emotion, and he turned abruptly, storming down the short hallway to his room. The slam of his door rattled the windows, making everyone flinch. Eli stood up slowly, his expression carefully controlled. "I think you should go now," he said to Daniel, not unkindly, but firmly. Daniel nodded, reaching into his pocket and placing a business card on the table. He didn't try to argue or plead his case further. He simply gathered his jacket from where he'd draped it over a chair and moved toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Micah's quiet voice stopped him. He didn't lie. The words were soft but clear in the stillness of the apartment. Daniel paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, then stepped out into the hallway without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the brothers alone with the physical evidence of a past they'd never known existed. The evening crept in slowly, bringing with it a heavy stillness that settled over the apartment like a thick blanket. The TV flickered silently in the corner of the living room, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The three brothers sat scattered around the small space, each absorbed in their own piece of the puzzle that had been dropped into their lives that morning. Noah had claimed the worn armchair by the window, his body tense and still, a stark contrast to his usual restless energy. He hadn't spoken since his outburst hours earlier, his silence more telling than any words could be. His eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the window, though the view offered nothing but the brick wall of the neighboring building. Micah sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the couch, their mother's journal open in his lap. His fingers moved carefully over each page, treating the faded paper as if it might crumble at any moment. Every now and then, he would pause, recognizing a phrase or expression that echoed in his memories of their mother. Eli occupied the other end of the couch, the thick missing person report spread out on the coffee table before him. His methodical mind cataloged each detail. The initial report filed by Daniel on March 15, 2007, the subsequent police statements, the timeline of searches, and the frustratingly brief notation marking the case's closure after a year of dead ends. The document told a story of systematic searching, of leads followed and hopes dashed, all documented in the sterile language of law enforcement. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. A car horn blared from the street below, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed. But inside their apartment, the silence held. Micah's sharp intake of breath broke through the stillness. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully turned to the back pages of the journal. "There's something else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah's head turned slightly, though he didn't fully face his brother. Eli leaned forward, his attention shifting from the report. Micah cleared his throat and read. I watched him from across the street. He looked tired, older. He still wore the scarf I gave him, but I couldn't go to him. I didn't know how. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Their mother had seen Daniel during his search. She had watched him looking for her, and she had chosen to remain hidden. Noah's hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. The muscle in his jaw twitched, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. She was broke. We were kids. He stood up abruptly, his movement sharp and angry. He was rich and free, and she watched him walk away. That's not what happened, Micah said, closing the journal carefully but firmly. She was scared. She had her reasons. Reasons? Noah's voice rose. What reasons could justify watching us struggle while he lived in his fancy house with his fancy car? He gestured wildly at the worn furniture around them. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment until we were 12. Mom worked double shifts. We ate mac and cheese 4 nights a week. You don't know what she was going through. Micah shot back, rising to his feet. The journal clutched protectively against his chest. You didn't see how scared she was sometimes, how she'd jump at unexpected noises, how she'd check the locks 3 times before bed. Oh, and you did? Noah stepped closer to Micah, his face flushed with anger. You were 5, just like the rest of us. You don't remember any more than I do. I remember enough, Micah's voice cracked. I remember her crying when she thought we were asleep. I remember her hand shaking when she wrote our names on school forms. I remember... Stop it. Eli's voice cut through their argument like a knife. He stood between them, one hand on each brother's chest, pushing them apart. Both of you, stop. His tone was firm but controlled, the voice of reason he'd cultivated over years of mediating their conflicts. This isn't helping anyone. Noah jerked away from Eli's hand, but the fight seemed to drain out of him. He slumped back into the armchair, running his hands over his face. Micah sank back down to the floor, the journal still held close. Eli looked between his brothers, then at the box still sitting on their kitchen table, its contents spread out like evidence at a trial. The clock on the wall showed it was past midnight, the hour hand creeping toward 1. The day's revelations felt both overwhelming and somehow incomplete, like a puzzle with crucial pieces still missing. After a long moment, Eli pulled out his phone. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard briefly before he typed out a message to Daniel. "We're not ready to talk, but we're listening." He set the phone down without waiting for a response. None came. The brothers eventually drifted off to their respective rooms, leaving the box and its contents untouched on the table, a silent testament to the day that had upended their world. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the kitchen windows and the familiar sounds of Joey's auto repair coming to life below. Eli, always the first one up, opened their apartment door to check for any mail that might have arrived the previous evening. Instead of mail, he found a thick black binder placed carefully on their welcome mat. The label on its spine read simply, "My Search, 2007 to 2008. Inside, the binder told a story through paper trails and receipts. Gas station charges from 5 different states. Hotel bills from countless small towns. Handwritten notes on diner placemats and motel notepads. A timeline meticulously constructed with dates, locations, and possible sightings. Bus station inquiries. Hospital records requests. Private investigator invoices. Page after page documented the desperate search of a man looking for his wife. Each receipt and scribbled note, a breadcrumb on a trail that led nowhere. The man who had stood in their apartment yesterday, who had brought white tulips to their mother's grave, had really searched. He had searched everywhere, following every lead, no matter how small. The evidence was there in black and white, in faded ink and crumpled receipts, in coffee-stained maps and highlighted phone records. Daniel Marlowe had spent a year of his life trying to find their mother, and by extension, them. The morning light crept through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The 3 brothers sat at their small table, each with a bowl of cereal growing soggy as they stared at the black binder that dominated the center of the table. Steam rose from their coffee mugs, untouched. Eli finally reached for the binder, his movements deliberate and careful. The plastic cover made a soft cracking sound as he opened it, revealing the first page, a meticulously organized timeline. The date at the top read March 14th, 2007. Last seen at home, argument about moving to Boston for new firm position. Elle said she felt trapped. I said she was being selfish. She left after dinner. Car gone by morning. The entries that followed were equally detailed, each one written in the same precise handwriting. March 15th, filed missing persons report. Officer Martinez took statement, checked local hospitals. March 16th, contacted Elle's friends from art class. No one has heard from her. March 17th, drove to her sister's house in Portland. Not there. Sister hasn't heard from her in weeks. Look at this, Eli said, pointing to a collection of plane tickets paperclipped to one page. They fanned out like playing cards. Seattle, Phoenix, Denver, Houston, Miami. Each ticket had a corresponding hotel receipt and a handwritten note about potential leads. Micah leaned in closer, his finger tracing the dates. He went to every city where someone reported seeing someone who looked like her. Noah pushed his cereal bowl away and pulled the binder closer. The pages were filled with interview notes from bus station employees, coffee shop workers, motel clerks. Each conversation was documented with the person's name, location, and what they remembered about a woman matching Lena's description. One page held a collection of receipts from a small bakery in Arizona, the Desert Rose Cafe. Paperclipped to the receipts was a crumpled napkin with familiar handwriting. Apple pie plus chamomile tea. The handwriting was unmistakably their mother's. She was there, Micah whispered, touching the napkin gently. He actually got close. They turned the page and found a photograph, slightly out of focus but clear enough. Their mother sat alone on a wooden bench outside what looked like a bus station. She wore a loose sweater that couldn't quite hide her pregnant belly. Her face was turned away, looking at something beyond the frame. She had no idea she was being photographed. The silence in the kitchen grew heavier. Eli sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "She really did run," he said quietly, his voice a mix of realization and something else, maybe sadness, maybe understanding. Micah nodded slowly, still looking at the photo. And he really did try. His fingers traced the edge of the photograph, as if touching it might somehow connect him to that moment, to the mother they never really knew. Noah pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "People try when it's easy," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Try staying for 18 years. Try working double shifts to feed 3 kids. Try explaining to your sons why they don't have a father." He gestured at the binder. This is just guilt on paper." The brothers let his words hang in the air, each processing them in their own way. Eli carefully closed the binder, his movements measured and thoughtful. Micah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below, where the auto shop was coming to life. Noah paced the small kitchen, his energy contained but volatile. The morning passed slowly, each brother retreating into their own thoughts while remaining acutely aware of the binder's presence. It sat on the table like a silent witness to a story they were only beginning to understand. As afternoon approached, Eli stood up. "We should go," he said simply. His brothers knew where he meant without asking. They grabbed their keys and headed out, leaving their half-drunk coffee cups and untouched breakfast behind. The cemetery was quiet when they arrived, the overcast sky casting everything in soft, gray light. They walked the familiar path to their mother's grave, but stopped short when they saw a figure already there. Daniel knelt beside the headstone, carefully removing dried grass from around its base. His suit jacket lay folded beside him, his white shirt sleeves rolled up as he worked. He was so focused on his task that he didn't hear their approach. Micah stepped forward first, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "We read it," he said quietly, but clearly. "All of it." Daniel's hand stilled on the headstone. He didn't turn around immediately, but they could see his shoulders tense at the sound of Micah's voice. After a moment, he stood slowly and faced them, brushing dirt from his hands. "Then you know the truth," he said simply, his voice steady but cautious. Noah moved forward, positioning himself slightly in front of his brothers, his eyes fixed on Daniel with a hard stare. "We know your version," he said, each word precise and sharp. "Now it's time for hers." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the apartment windows as Daniel stood awkwardly in the doorway. The space felt smaller with him in it, his tall frame and pressed suit a stark contrast to the worn furniture and automotive posters on the walls. Eli gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, but with no warmth either. Daniel complied, settling into the creaky wooden chair while Micah disappeared into his bedroom. Noah leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching Daniel with undisguised suspicion. The silence stretched between them until Micah returned, carrying a cardboard box that had clearly been opened and resealed many times. The tape was yellowed, the corners soft from handling. "These were Mom's," Micah said, placing the box on the table. "Her journals, all of them." His fingers lingered on the lid for a moment before he stepped back. Daniel stared at the box, his hands flat on the table as if steadying himself. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli nodded. "That's why we asked you here." With careful movements, Daniel lifted the lid. Inside, a dozen notebooks were stacked neatly, their pages worn and wavy from years of use. Some had dates written on their covers in Lena's flowing script. Others were marked only by different colored covers. He lifted the first journal as if it might crumble in his hands. The cover was blue, dated 2007. The pages made a soft rustling sound as he opened it, and his breath caught visibly when he saw Lena's handwriting filling the pages. The brothers watched him read, noting how his fingers traced the edge of each page before turning it. how his eyes moved slowly across each line as if memorizing every word. His face remained composed, but his hands trembled slightly. After several minutes of silence, Noah spoke up. "Read it," he said, out loud. Daniel looked up, surprised. "Are you sure?" "We've read them all already," Eli explained. "We want to hear how they sound to you." Daniel nodded slowly and cleared his throat. His voice was steady as he began reading from a page marked with a folded corner. April 12, 2007. There was a payphone outside the grocery store today. I stood there for 20 minutes, quarter in my hand, his number running through my head like a song I can't forget. I imagined his voice, what he'd say. Would he be angry? Relieved? I put the quarter in 3 times, took it back 3 times. The babies were kicking so hard, like they knew, like they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't do it. I walked away, again. He paused, his finger marking the place on the page. The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic below. "Keep going," Micah said softly. "The next one." Daniel turned several pages and found another entry, this one written in shakier handwriting. May 30th, 2007. They're here, all 3 of them. When the doctor said triplets, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard them cry, and it was real. So real. They're beautiful and terrifying and perfect. If Daniel were here, he'd laugh. He always wanted a big family. But I made this choice. Now I carry it. Daniel's voice cracked on the last words. He tried to continue reading, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. His composure, maintained so carefully until now, began to crack. Without a word, he stood up and walked quickly to the small balcony, sliding the door closed behind him. Through the glass, they could see his shoulders shaking as he gripped the railing. The man who had appeared so controlled, so careful with his words and actions, was breaking apart in front of them. Eli looked at his brothers. Noah had turned away, his jaw tight. Micah sat staring at the open journal, his expression unreadable. After a moment, Eli stood and walked to the balcony door. The evening air was cool as he stepped outside. Daniel had his back to the door, one hand covering his face, the other still gripping the railing. He straightened when he heard Eli approach but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice rough. "I just needed a minute." Eli moved to stand beside him, looking out at the city skyline. "We still don't know what we're supposed to do with you," he said quietly. Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve, a startlingly human gesture from someone who had seemed so composed. "I don't either," he admitted, finally turning to face Eli. His eyes were red, but his voice had steadied. "But I'm not here to fix the past. I just want to be here for whatever comes next." The balcony door slid open again, and Micah stepped out. He looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "Then stop waiting on the porch," he said. "Sit with us." The morning sun streamed through the apartment windows, casting warm patches on the living room floor, where 4 figures sat surrounded by memories spread out before them. Photo albums lay open, their plastic sheets reflecting glints of light. Journals were stacked in careful piles, and Daniel's meticulously organized binder sat among them like a bridge between 2 worlds. They had moved from the kitchen to the floor almost unconsciously, the casual arrangement somehow making it easier to breathe, to talk, to exist in this strange new reality they shared. Eli sat cross-legged, his back against the couch while Micah lounged on his stomach, chin propped on his hands. Noah had positioned himself slightly apart from the group, back against the wall, but he remained within the circle. Daniel sat with one knee drawn up, his tie loosened and jacket discarded hours ago. He looked different here on the floor, less like the successful businessman who had first appeared at the cemetery, and more like someone who could have been their father all along. "We should share stories," Eli suggested, breaking the morning quiet. "Things about Mom that aren't in the journals. Things only we would know." He glanced at Daniel. Both sides, Daniel nodded, his fingers trailing over the edge of a photo album. "I'd like that," he said softly. There was so much about her that could never be captured in writing. "Like what?" Micah asked, his voice encouraging. A small smile touched Daniel's lips as he remembered. "She used to leave me notes in my shoes," he said. "Every morning before work, I'd find something tucked inside. Sometimes just a heart drawn on a scrap of paper, sometimes a whole letter. She said it was to make sure I walked with love all day." Micah's eyes widened slightly. "She did that with our backpacks," he said. "Little notes in the front pocket, every first day of school. And during finals week," Eli added. "Remember?" Daniel's smile grew warmer. "She loved leaving pieces of herself for people to find," he said. "And movies. She used to cry during happy movies. More than sad ones, actually. Said joy was harder to handle than sadness." "She still did that," Micah said, sitting up straighter. "We watched Field of Dreams last year, and she was sobbing by the end. Happy sobbing, but still." "Remember when we watched The Princess Bride?" Eli asked, looking at his brothers. She kept rewinding the grandfather scenes. "Because they reminded her of her own grandfather," Daniel said automatically, then paused, surprised at himself. "She told me that once. Her grandfather used to read to her when she was sick." The room grew quiet for a moment, the shared memory hanging between them like a delicate thread. "She hated elevators," Eli said suddenly. "She'd take the stairs up 6 flights just to avoid." "Because she got stuck in one once," Daniel finished. "For 7 hours." His eyes met Eli's. "I brought her dinner through the door crack. The maintenance crew couldn't get it moving, so I sat outside the elevator and read to her until they fixed it." A laugh bubbled up from Micah, unexpected and genuine. Eli joined in, and even Daniel chuckled, the sound rusty as if he hadn't used it in years. The memory of Lena, stubborn and claustrophobic, united them for a brief moment in shared amusement. Noah remained silent, but his posture had softened slightly. His arms no longer crossed so tightly across his chest. His eyes moved between the photos and Daniel's face, searching for something only he knew. They continued sharing stories as the morning stretched into afternoon. Daniel told them about Lena's attempt to learn guitar, which lasted exactly 2 weeks before she declared her fingers weren't made for strings. Micah described how she would sing in the kitchen, making up lyrics about whatever she was cooking. Eli remembered her collection of random facts, how she would drop them into conversation without warning. Noah listened to it all, his silence a presence in itself. His eyes never left the scattered memories on the floor, taking in every detail, every photograph, every piece of evidence that connected their world to Daniel's. As afternoon faded into evening, exhaustion began to settle over the group. Micah dozed off first, curled up on the floor with a photo album as his pillow. Eli followed soon after, slumped against the couch. Even Daniel's eyes grew heavy, and he eventually settled into the armchair, his breathing becoming deep and regular. Noah waited until he was sure they were all asleep. Then, moving silently, he reached for the binder that had been sitting untouched for the past few hours. He knew there was one envelope he hadn't seen yet, one marked simply Lena's spot. The envelope was worn at the edges, as if it had been opened many times before. Inside, Noah found a single piece of paper, a sketch done in careful pencil strokes. It showed Lena sitting under a large tree by a lake, her face peaceful, caught in a moment of perfect stillness. The artist's hand had captured her exactly as Noah remembered her. The slight tilt of her head, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the curve of her smile. He turned the paper over. On the back, in handwriting that matched the missing person reports and timeline entries, was a simple message. "If I ever find you again, this is where I'll start over." Noah stared at the words for a long moment. Then, with the same careful movements he'd used to remove it, he slipped the sketch back into its envelope. He didn't throw it away. He didn't tear it up. He simply put it back in the binder, exactly where he'd found it, and returned to his spot against the wall. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing of his brothers and Daniel. Noah sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the pieces of a story he was only beginning to understand, and said nothing at all. The morning after their long night of sharing stories, the apartment felt different. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating the scattered memories still spread across the floor. Micah sat at the kitchen table, Daniel's sketch of the lake in his hands, studying every pencil stroke. "We should go there," he said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over them. Eli looked up from where he was making coffee. "To the lake?" "Ridge Lake," Micah clarified, turning the sketch around to show his brothers. "It's real, I looked it up, about 3 hours north of here." Noah, who had been quietly organizing the scattered photos into neat piles, stopped mid-motion. "Why would we do that?" "Because Mom sat under that tree," Micah said softly. "Because it meant something to her, even if she never told us about it." Daniel, who had stepped out earlier to get breakfast for everyone, returned just then with a box of pastries. He caught the tail end of the conversation and hesitated in the doorway, uncertain if he should enter the discussion. Eli noticed his hesitation and made the decision for him. "Could you take us there?" he asked Daniel directly. "Of course," Daniel replied, setting the pastries down carefully. "Anytime you want." Noah's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly. "We don't need him to drive us. We have a car." "A car that barely made it to the cemetery last week," Micah pointed out gently. He turned to face his brother fully. "Noah, we're not doing this for him. We're doing this for her." The words hung in the air between them. Noah's jaw clenched, but something in Micah's tone made him pause. He looked at the sketch again, at the peaceful expression their mother wore in Daniel's careful rendering. "Fine," he said finally, "but we leave today. Now." Within an hour, they were on the road. Daniel's black sedan was spotless, the leather seats cool and comfortable. Eli sat in the front passenger seat, navigating with his phone, while Micah and Noah took the back. The first hour passed in tense silence, broken only by occasional directions from Eli. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through rolling hills and scattered forests. Daniel drove steadily, his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing in the rear-view mirror at the boys. No one turned on the radio. The quiet felt too important to break. As they passed through small towns and open countryside, the landscape began to change. The hills grew steeper, the trees more numerous. Eli's phone announced they were getting close just as the late afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. Ridge Lake appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, its surface gleaming like polished glass in the evening light. Daniel slowed the car, turning onto a gravel path that led to a small parking area. The tree from the sketch was immediately visible, taller now, its branches reaching further across the sky, but unmistakably the same one. They got out of the car slowly, stretching legs stiff from the journey. Daniel walked toward the tree first, his steps measured and deliberate. When he reached it, he placed his hand on the rough bark, his fingers tracing old patterns. "This is where I proposed to her," he said quietly, but his voice carried to where the boys stood. "Right here, under these branches." She was reading a book, not paying attention to me at all. I had to say her name 3 times before she looked up. The boys moved closer, drawn by the story despite themselves. The tree's shadow stretched long across the grass, just as it had in Daniel's sketch. Daniel knelt down suddenly, his hand searching beneath a small, flat stone near the tree's base. After a moment, he pulled out a rusted tin box, its edges worn smooth by time and weather. "I didn't know if it would still be here," he said, turning the box over in his hands. With careful fingers, he pried open the lid. Inside lay a single folded piece of paper, protected from the elements by the tight seal of the tin. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but still readable. On the outside was written simply, D. Daniel unfolded it slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat and read aloud, "If you're reading this, you found the tree. Maybe you found them too. Don't expect them to understand you. Just love them anyway." The words settled over them like falling leaves. Micah sank down onto the grass, his eyes fixed on the lake. Eli leaned against the tree trunk, his hand unconsciously finding the same spot where Daniel's had rested. Noah remained standing, but his usual rigid posture had softened. The sun was beginning its final descent, touching the lake's surface and setting it ablaze with orange and gold light. They all sat down then, arranging themselves in a loose circle under the tree's spreading branches. The evening air was cool and still, carrying the scent of water and woods. Daniel held the letter carefully in his lap, his fingers tracing the edges. "I never wanted to stop looking," he said into the gathering dusk. "I just ran out of places to search." Noah looked at him then, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since the cemetery. His voice, when it came, held no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of truth. "You found the last one." They stayed there as darkness crept in, watching the sun disappear completely behind the lake's far shore. Stars began to appear overhead, reflected in the still water below. No one suggested leaving. No one checked the time. They simply sat together under the tree where their story had begun, letting the night gather around them like a gentle blanket. The lake lapped softly at its shores. Crickets began their evening chorus, and in the growing darkness, 4 figures remained beneath the old tree, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow, for the first time, truly together. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ridge Lake as Daniel, Noah, Eli, and Micah emerged from their rented cabin. They'd stayed the night after none of them felt ready to make the drive back in the dark. The small lakeside diner beckoned with promises of hot coffee and breakfast, its neon "open" sign flickering in the early light. Inside, they settled into a worn vinyl booth. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, distributed menus and filled their coffee cups without asking. Steam rose from the dark liquid, creating small clouds that dissipated in the cool morning air. The silence between them felt different now, less like a wall and more like a shared breath. Eli studied the menu intently while Micah traced patterns in the condensation on his water glass. Noah stared out the window at the lake, his expression thoughtful rather than angry for once. Daniel cleared his throat softly, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "There's something else I should tell you," he said, his voice careful and measured. "I found something recently, through an old forwarding address your mother once used." 3 pairs of eyes turned to him, waiting. "She had a storage unit," he continued. "It's still there, still paid for. I haven't gone inside yet. I thought maybe we could look through it together." The waitress returned with plates of eggs and pancakes, momentarily pausing the conversation. When she left, Micah was the first to speak. "You found her storage unit?" Daniel nodded, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate. "The payment was automatic, deducted from an old account. That's how I traced it." "And you haven't looked inside yet?" Noah asked, his tone surprisingly neutral. "No," Daniel replied. "It didn't feel right to do it alone." They finished their breakfast in contemplative silence. The drive to the storage facility took just over an hour, the facility itself a sprawling complex of identical orange doors set into concrete walls. Daniel led them to Unit 247, his key sliding smoothly into the lock. The metal door rolled up with a grinding sound, revealing a space filled with cardboard boxes, old furniture, and the collected memories of a life kept hidden. Dust motes danced in the beam of sunlight that cut through the darkness. Eli found the light switch, illuminating the unit with harsh fluorescent light. They moved inside carefully, as if entering a sacred space. Each box bore Lena's neat handwriting: kitchen, Photos, baby clothes. Micah picked up a small drawing from an open box, clearly made by a child's hand. 3 stick figures stood holding hands, scribbled in crayon. "I remember making this," he said softly. They worked methodically through the boxes, discovering pieces of their shared past. Report cards, childhood toys, old grocery lists with Lena's familiar handwriting. Each item seemed to hold a story, a moment frozen in time. Then Noah found it, a box different from the others. Unlike the casual labels on the other containers, this one bore careful block letters, "If they ever ask." The brothers exchanged glances. Daniel stepped back, giving them space as they gathered around the box. Inside, they found 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing one of their names in their mother's distinctive script. Beneath these lay a leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with the words, "The year I disappeared." At the bottom of the box sat a USB drive. Micah picked up the notebook with trembling hands. The pages crackled as he opened it, the paper aged but well preserved. He began to read aloud. "I left on a Tuesday. The sun was setting, and Daniel was at work. I packed only what would fit in my car. I told myself I would come back once I figured things out, once I found myself again. But even then, I think I knew I was lying." The words flowed like water, telling the story of a young woman who felt increasingly lost in a world that seemed too big, too polished, too perfect. She wrote about Daniel's success, his growing influence, the society parties, and charity galas. But more than that, she wrote about her own diminishing sense of self. "It wasn't that he was cruel," Micah read, his voice catching. "He was kind, always kind. But in his world, I felt like a shadow. Everyone knew me as Daniel's wife. I couldn't remember who I was before that title. And then, when I discovered I was pregnant, I couldn't bear the thought of our children growing up in that shadow too." Eli connected the USB drive to his phone. The first video began to play, showing Lena sitting in what looked like a small apartment. She looked younger, tired, but determined. "Happy birthday, my boys," she said to the camera. "You're turning 1 today. I wish I could tell you everything now, explain why things are the way they are. But some truths have to wait until you're ready to hear them." They watched more videos, each one a birthday message, each one showing Lena growing older, her hair graying slightly, her face gaining lines around the eyes. In one of the later videos, she paused before speaking. "If I could give you anything," she said, looking directly into the camera, "it wouldn't be money or comfort. It'd be the truth, and the choice to forgive." Noah stood abruptly, the weight of his mother's words becoming too heavy to bear. He walked out of the storage unit, into the bright sunlight. Daniel watched him go, then quietly followed. Outside, Noah sat on the curb, his head in his hands. Daniel hesitated before lowering himself to sit beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for several long moments, watching cars pass on the street. Finally, Noah spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't hate you. I hate that she never gave you the chance." Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, the words hitting him like a physical weight. "So do I," he replied simply. They remained there, side by side on the curb, until footsteps announced Eli and Micah's approach. No words were exchanged as they joined their brother and father, but something had shifted in the air between them, like the first thaw after a long winter. The morning was crisp and clear as Daniel walked through the cemetery gates, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. This time felt different. He hadn't come on his own, seeking solace in silent visits. The boys had called him here. He spotted them waiting near Lena's grave, their figures casting long shadows in the early light. Micah held a rolled paper in his hands, turning it over and over with nervous energy. As Daniel approached, he noticed fresh coffee cups from the local diner, balanced on the flat stones bordering the plot. "You came," Eli said, not a question but an acknowledgement. His voice carried none of its usual guardedness. Daniel nodded, accepting the extra coffee cup Noah wordlessly held out to him. The gesture, small as it was, felt monumental. Micah unfolded the paper he'd been holding, smoothing it carefully against his knee. "We've been thinking," he said, his quiet voice steady, "about the headstone." Daniel moved closer to see the design Micah had sketched. The drawing showed a simple but elegant stone, curved at the top with delicate engravings of wildflowers along the sides, the same kind Lena used to pick on their walks years ago. His throat tightened at the detail. "We want to change it," Noah said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "The current one, it doesn't say enough." Eli stepped forward, pointing to the proposed inscription Micah had carefully lettered beneath the design. "Lena Marlowe," he read aloud, "beloved mother, missed wife, fierce soul." Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he traced the words with his finger. "It's perfect," he managed to say. "There's more," Micah said softly. He indicated the line below. "Forever remembered by Eli, Noah, Micah, and Daniel." The silence that followed felt holy somehow, like a prayer without words. Daniel stared at his name there, included among theirs, and had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. The cemetery director, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, approached with the paperwork they'd requested earlier. She smiled warmly at the group as she explained the various options and costs. When she mentioned the possibility of adding a memory bench near the grave, Daniel immediately reached for his wallet. "We could place it right there," Mrs. Patterson suggested, gesturing to a spot beneath a young maple tree. "It would be lovely for visitors to—" "This one's on us," Eli interrupted, his tone firm but gentle as he looked at Daniel. The other two nodded in agreement. They spent the next few hours working together around the gravesite. Noah, with his mechanical precision, repainted the border stones a pristine white. Micah carefully planted small wildflowers in the soil, purple asters and white daisies that would return year after year. Eli organized the area, clearing away dead leaves and arranging fresh mulch. Daniel watched them work, struck by how each task reflected their personalities: Noah's attention to detail, Micah's artistic touch, Eli's systematic approach. When he pulled out 4 fresh white tulips from his car, no one commented on the number. It felt natural now, including him in their ritual. The sun began its slow descent, painting the cemetery in warm golden light. They sat together on the grass beside Lena's grave, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor. The fresh paint gleamed, the newly planted flowers swayed in the gentle breeze, and the paperwork for the new headstone lay signed and ready in Mrs. Patterson's office. Micah broke the contemplative silence, his voice soft but clear in the evening air. "She never let us hate you," he said, picking absently at a blade of grass. "Even when we wanted to." Daniel's breath caught in his throat at these words. He remembered the journal entries they'd found, how even in her pain and fear, Lena had never written with bitterness. "You were a story without a face," Eli added, his analytical mind as always seeking to define things clearly. "Now we know it." Noah shifted his position, leaning back on his elbows in the grass. His face held the same guarded expression it usually did, but something had softened around his eyes. "Still not calling you Dad," he muttered, the words carrying more wry acceptance than anger. Daniel couldn't help the chuckle that escaped him, even as tears began to roll down his cheeks. "Fair enough," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The morning sun painted the cemetery in bright, warm light as the 3 brothers made their way through the iron gates. Each carried their traditional bouquets, Micah with sunflowers that seemed to catch and hold the sunshine, Eli with delicate lilacs that perfumed the air, and Noah clutching violets that reminded them of the tiny flowers their mother used to press between book pages. They walked the familiar path to Lena's grave, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The new headstone gleamed in the morning light, its fresh engravings crisp and clear against the polished surface. But as they approached, they stopped short. 4 bouquets already rested against the stone. 3 spaces were empty, clearly left for their flowers, but the 4th bundle, pristine white tulips wrapped in simple brown paper, made them pause. The flowers were so fresh that dewdrops still clung to the petals. "Happy birthday, Mom," Micah whispered, placing his sunflowers in one of the empty spots. His brothers followed suit, arranging their flowers carefully beside his. A gentle rustling came from behind the old oak tree nearby, and Daniel stepped out into the sunlight. He wore casual clothes today, jeans and a soft sweater, rather than his usual suit. His eyes were tired but warm, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I couldn't sleep," he explained, running a hand through his slightly disheveled hair. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of shared understanding. None of them had likely slept well the night before, their thoughts full of Lena, and this day that had always belonged to just the 4 of them, mother and sons. Without discussion, they settled onto the grass around the grave. The awkward tension that had marked their earlier meetings was notably absent. Instead, there was a quiet comfort in their shared purpose. Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out their mother's favorite tea set, the delicate blue porcelain cups and the thermos of perfectly brewed chamomile tea. It was the same blend Lena had always preferred, especially on Sunday mornings when she would sit with her boys and tell them stories about her dreams. Daniel watched as Eli poured the tea with practiced care into each cup. When he filled the 4th cup, Lena's cup, Daniel reached out and gently placed it beside his white tulips. The gesture felt natural, as if they'd been doing this together for years instead of weeks. "She used to drink it with honey," Daniel said softly, his eyes fixed on the steaming cup. "2 spoonfuls, never more. Said it ruined the flavor otherwise." Micah nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "She kept that habit. We always knew when she was stressed because she'd add an extra spoon." They began sharing memories, their voices growing easier and more animated as they spoke. These weren't the heavy, grief-laden stories they usually shared at the grave. Today, they celebrated her. The way she would sing off-key while cooking, how she could never resist buying books even when money was tight, her terrible attempts at knitting that resulted in misshapen scarves they'd worn proudly anyway. As the morning wore on, their conversation drifted to the future. Micah pulled out his sketchbook, showing Daniel his latest designs. The pages were filled with architectural drawings and furniture concepts, each bearing the same artistic touch that had always marked his mother's own sketches. "I've been thinking about design school," Micah admitted, his fingers tracing the lines of his latest work. "Mom always said I had an eye for it." "She was right," Daniel responded, studying the drawings with genuine interest. His architect's eye caught the technical skill behind the artistic flair. Eli cleared his throat, pulling out a folder of his own. "I've been researching scholarships," he said, his organized nature evident in the carefully tabbed pages. "There are some good programs that combine business and environmental studies." Noah, who had been quieter than the others, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about taking a trip," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "Following some of the places Mom wrote about in her journals. Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado." He trailed off, glancing at Daniel almost involuntarily. Daniel listened to each of them, his responses measured and gentle. When Noah mentioned the road trip, he didn't immediately offer money or solutions. Instead, he shared his own knowledge of those places from his search years ago. Good diners, scenic routes, quiet spots where Lena might have found peace. "I know some people in those areas," he said carefully. "If you ever want local insight. No pressure, though, just an offer." The sun climbed higher in the sky as they talked, warming the stone beneath them. Finally, Eli checked his watch and began gathering the empty teacups. They stood slowly, brushing grass from their clothes and taking one last look at the flowers arranged around Lena's name. Noah lingered as the others started walking toward the gate. He stood with his hands in his pockets, scuffing his shoe against the ground in a gesture that reminded Daniel painfully of Lena. Without turning to look at Daniel, Noah spoke, his voice gruff but clear. "We're grabbing lunch. You coming? Or what?" Daniel felt tears spring to his eyes, but he blinked them back quickly. His smile was warm and a bit wobbly as he replied, Yes, I'd like that." They walked together toward the cemetery gates, leaving the grave behind them. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the grass, 4 figures moving in the same direction, no one walking away. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and the Triplets, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.